Welcome back to FreightWaves Now, and now, shipping's own Jim Cantori, Sal Mercogliano. How are you, Doctor?
I'm doing fine. You had me on, Mark Scott on just before. This is like FreightWaves University going on here. We're going to have to make Craig Fuller Dean or Provost of some kind.
That's all we need. We'd have the trifecta if we had him on up next to try to put the commencement address on, right?
It'd be perfect. It'd be perfect like that. I appreciate the analogy. Again, I am the face of maritime disasters around the world.
You are, and you've got some great information for us here. There's finally a salvage plan, I guess. Some details coming out for the Ever Forward.
That's beyond a Freudian slip, but it's perfect. Yeah, you're right. We do have word finally on a salvage plan being implemented. So Don John Smith, who's in charge of the salvage, is bringing in two of their cranes. They're in the process of modifying them so they can reach above the container stacks right now. So they're looking for about a week of operations from about April 9th to April 16th. Plans take about 550 of the 5,000 containers off the vessel and then some ballast off the vessel. And that should give them about 10,000 tons off the ship.
Okay.
And they're still dredging. They still have the Dale Piatt and the Oyster Bay performing their dredging. Their hope is that by about mid-April, right around the highest tide in that period, and try to do it in conjunction with a favorable wind pushing water up the bay, they will try another attempt to try to swing her stern, pivot on that bow, just get her stern into the channel and be able to pull her off using the engines. Not exactly sure they'll be able to get the containers off. This is a very high-risk operation because of the moving of the crane on the barge. So it's going to be really weather-dependent on them being able to get that amount of weight off Michael.
Wow.
I think that's a great question. We've seen that Evergreen, they've recently blocked the Suez Canal as part of their world tour, and now we're at the port of Norfolk. It feels as though they're the ever stranded. Is this a chronic issue in shipping? Is it recent media attention, or is it just perhaps Evergreen is asleep at the helm, so to speak?
Well, I think, Thomas, I think they're on the unfortunate kind of high visibility of this. We've seen ships go aground before. We just had Maersk Mumbai go aground off Germany. But I have to say, since 2006, with the introduction of the Emma Maersk and these super large, ultra large container vessels, we have never had a salvage where we've actually had to take containers off the ship. I mean, we've had wrecks where you take the containers off. We've had container collapse stacks. But we've never been in a position where we have to take it off. And I think it's more, not so much Evergreen, but it's an indication of the growth and size of these vessels. As they grew in size, in length, in width, in depth, and now in speed too, the accidents that happen really push the limits of salvage capability. If you look at what's one of the big hindrances right now off the port of Baltimore is the size of tugs, sufficient dredging capacity to go in there. And most importantly, too, is the oversight that we usually provide for air transportation. We really don't have built in place for marine transportation. So there's not really a vessel traffic system. We don't have the automated systems for assisting the piloting of a vessel, much like you have on commercial airliners, for example.
Yeah, it would make sense that there's maybe a lack of correct math or concern looking at the size, width, depth, length, weight, and like you said, increase in speed when opening up some of these and doing some of these dredging operations. Perhaps not quite wide enough for the deepening of some of these channels is what it seems like. They've moved adrift here in that channel. But hey, oyster futures are going up now because of this salvage operation is what I hear. How about the shipping reform, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act? Will this address some of this stuff in the future?
Well, we just had the Senate, by a voice vote, pass their version of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and not to go into a Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law. Now you have two versions of this bill. They're going to have to get together and come up with a conference bill between the two and put it together. This is creating a lot of concern among ocean shippers. For this, they don't like the idea of regulation coming back in. I know on the trucking and the shipper side, one of the big issues I think that's really across both these bills that I think we will definitely see is detention demurrage issues come to the forefront. I think data collection and data visibility are really key. But one of the big issues right now is the fact that ocean carriers, particularly on the West Coast, don't want to take American exports. They want to get those empty boxes back to Asia as quick as they can, load them back for the more profitable run going from east to west than the less profitable west to east run. And right now, with what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, that issue makes the export of American agricultural commodities absolutely essential to fill the gap that's missing, that hole that's going to be missing by Ukraine and potentially by some Russian ships not being able to get out of the Black Sea.
With especially the recent supply chain disruptions because of shipping, that there may be a bipartisan push, or there's a lot of goodwill on Capitol Hill to enact this, because as you know, the industry, at least from my experience, I think it's heavily consolidated. There's like a handful of containers control 80% of shipping. Like, it's almost like you're going against a cartel that doesn't want to help the person it's delivering to.
Yeah, and matter of fact, one of the things we've seen is this new memorandum of understanding came out between the Department of Justice and the Federal Maritime Commission, where the Federal Maritime Commission, which is the independent agency that oversees ocean shipping, has basically signed this memorandum with the Department of Justice. And what we saw come right out of that was a subpoena levied against Maersk Lines for the release of information about this. My opinion is again, I don't think the ocean carriers were involved in any sort of price fixing during the past 2 years. They've made massive profits. We all know that. But again, go back the past 10 years, they were barely staying afloat. And sorry for the pun there. But they were barely staying afloat, coming across. And now, the potential here is really for the future. What's the future going forward? Because again, ocean companies now have been profitability. They see it now. And the question is, what mechanisms are in place to ensure that there isn't elements of price fixing going forward? And I think that's one of the key things we're going to see come out of the House and Senate versions of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Is there more oversight? Can the Federal Maritime Commission initiate their own investigations? Can they publish findings? Beforehand, they were very restricted in what they can do. But I am concerned that this memorandum of understanding really gets the administration more intertwined in an agency, the Federal Maritime Commission, that's supposed to be independent of political administrations.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that concern, right? We see the attention that is there, and obviously the importance that there is for international supply chains, and obviously maritime is a huge, huge portion of that. Is there concern that we get into a slippery slope where it doesn't make things better and it makes it much worse? I mean, we need these carriers to be healthy, and that means profitable, and have the desire to have these exports and move our goods, right? So how concerning is this moving forward that people are barking for something they really don't want?
I think it's the danger. The danger is the overreach right here, obviously. The danger is that Congress passes a law that will basically hamstring the ocean carriers and put too much regulation in place. Now, understand, once everything ever settles out, once we get past this flock of black swan events that keep hitting us, when things settle out, you're going to see the ocean carriers kind of nip in the bud some of these new ocean carriers that are making their appearance on the east to west run across the Pacific. You'll see freight rates eventually come back down a little bit, but then they'll come back up like they will. But I think the danger here is, how does Congress view this? The problem is they have basically been neglectful of this industry since the Shipping Act of 1984, the Ocean Reform Act of 98. Mm-hmm. And don't get me wrong, we benefited from it. We had great freight rates. I mean, we all remember those pre-COVID freight rates when it was $1,500 to move a box across the Pacific. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is, even with the freight rates at the level where they're at now, we're still getting pretty good transportation costs coming across the Pacific. As you spread freight across, the freight transportation cost across a 40-foot box, if you're dealing with phone charges, you don't see that still. It doesn't matter if it's 10 times as much. But with larger items, you do. And I think that's where we're going to start seeing shift in production and consumers. But you're right, Michael. I think we have to be concerned that Congress neglect something for 20 years and then all of a sudden they want to overreach it. And I think the fact that the World Shipping Council and other entities are going to be able to go and talk to this committee, hopefully will raise that issue. I think they need to hear not just from the ocean carriers, but also from the shippers ashore. And what do they want out of the Reform Act? Because they want to benefit from cheap rates too.
I think that's a great point. And final question here, kind of taking a contrarian take on this. Do you feel that maybe we have the opportunity, since we are such a huge importer from these places, to kind of leverage our buying power to say, look, you need to agree to some of this, because otherwise we'll find a way to either near short, or we'll come up with solutions if you guys cannot, at least amongst yourselves, find a way to help make it more beneficial for our consumers?
I think one of the problems we have, Thomas, is we don't have a lot of leverage in this. We really don't. I mean, the ocean carriers seem to have really all the cards in their hands. For example, we don't have a U.S. ocean carrier that can compete at that level. The closest one we have that's wholly U.S. owned is Matson, but they're number 26 in the world.
We created the first U.S. carrier. I think if the history was, it was a U.S. trucker that made the first ocean-going vessel. We started the shipping container. It's almost, do you believe that may be a problem, that even though we came up with containerization, we don't have a leg in the race?
Well, I mean, Malcolm McLean, again, I always come back to that fact that it was a trucker that comes up with containerization. And I keep thinking that hopefully there's a trucker on a line outside of LA Long Beach right now who has the next solution to this. But you're right. The problem is we're at the limits of containerization. We've basically pushed this concept of freight movement to its limits. And, there needs to be that innovation. There needs to be that solution. And I think one of the things that I really hope to see coming out of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act was more integration and oversight of all those elements that do the containers. It's not just the ports and the ships, but it's the rail, it's the road, it's aviation, it's all those elements together. For example, the $1.2 billion port infrastructure bill sounds great. It sounds great to be investing in the ports, but is there a coherent plan for the allocation of money to this? Look at the Port of Baltimore. It is a great little port that does fantastic job. It does rail. It does bulk. It does cars. It does containers. Do we want more ports like that, or do we want to consolidate into LA, Long Beach, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, and Houston, in which case we see these obstructions again when the freight rate goes up? Remember, things are down from LA and Long Beach. We're 60% down from the peak of ships waiting off the coast, but we're still 3,000% higher than it was pre-COVID. So, there's still 30 plus ships waiting off there.
Absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. Insightful, entertaining, very informative as always, Doctor. And we look forward to seeing you again, my friend. You have a great weekend, and thanks for being on the show.
I appreciate being with you guys. Thanks.